A police officer. An abandoned car left untouched for months. And a miracle of the Virgin Mary that no one has ever been able to explain. But before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country right now. I would love to see how far these stories of miracles are reaching. Michael had been a police officer in Ohio for 12 years. No heroic shootouts. No dramatic action scenes like in the movies. Just real police work. Reports. Calls. Routine patrols. On that October Tuesday morning, Michael received yet another call about an abandoned car. The third one that week. He wrote down the address, grabbed his keys, and headed toward his patrol car. Another vehicle. Another report. Another ordinary day. The address led him to a neighborhood that probably exists in every city. Simple houses. Some carefully maintained with trimmed lawns and bright flowers. Others showing their age, peeling paint, tall grass, fences leaning slightly to one side. There was the typical large tree at the corner of the street. The kind neighbors always use as a reference. You know the house after the big tree? It was that kind of place. Children usually played in the street after school. A dog barked whenever strangers walked past. An elderly woman often sat on her porch, quietly observing everything. Life there moved slowly. People knew each other by name. As Michael turned onto the street, he spotted the car immediately. It was parked on an empty lot between two houses. From a distance, it looked forgotten. The model was probably 15 years old. The original color was hard to tell under the thick layer of dirt. Michael parked his patrol car nearby, stepped out, and closed the door. Before he could even approach the vehicle, an elderly man came walking quickly from the house next door. "Officer, glad you came," the man said, slightly out of breath. "Sorry for the delay," Michael replied calmly. "We've had a lot of calls lately." The officer approached him. "How long has the car been here?" The man scratched the back of his head. 3 months, at least. Maybe more. It showed up one night and just stayed there. We thought the owner would come back for it, but nobody ever did. Did anyone see who left it here?" Michael asked. The man shook his head. "No. I woke up the next morning and it was already there. Nobody saw anything. Has anyone tried to open the car? Touched it?" "No, sir," the man answered quickly. "We left it alone and called the police." "All right," Michael said. "I'll take a look." "Thank you, officer." The man nodded and slowly walked back to his house. But he remained near the window, watching. Michael walked toward the car. The grass around it had grown tall, almost hiding the flat tires beneath. Dry branches had fallen onto the hood. Dust covered everything. He walked slowly around the vehicle, examining it carefully. The rear window was cracked. The passenger side mirror hung loosely from the door. The bumper was dented. Finally, he reached the driver's door and pulled the handle. It opened. It wasn't locked. And the moment the door swung open, the smell hit him. Have you ever smelled a place that's been closed for too long? It's a mixture of mold, stale air, the unmistakable scent of abandonment. Michael turned his head away for a moment and took a deep breath of fresh air. Then he looked inside. The interior was exactly what he expected. Dust everywhere. The dashboard covered in a thick gray layer. The steering wheel looked like it hadn't been touched in months. The seats were torn. Yellow foam pushed out through the ripped fabric. The ceiling lining hung down in spots, stained by moisture. Nothing of value inside. No radio. When Michael opened the glove compartment, it was completely empty. He returned to his patrol car, grabbed his clipboard, and began writing the report. Make, model, estimated year, general condition, standard procedure. Just another abandoned vehicle. He was almost finished when something caught his eye. On the passenger seat, there was an object. Michael stopped writing. It was a statue of the Virgin Mary. He tilted his head slightly and stepped closer. The figure was made of plaster, carefully painted, about 30 centimeters tall. The Virgin Mary wore a light blue mantle. Her hands were gently clasped in prayer. Her face carried a calm, peaceful expression. It was delicate, beautifully crafted, but that wasn't what surprised him. What surprised him was something else entirely. Michael looked again at the inside of the car. Dust covered everything. The dashboard, the steering wheel, the seats, the floor, every surface. Then he looked again at the statue. Not a single grain of dust. The colors were vivid. The blue mantle looked almost luminous. Her face was perfectly clean, untouched. It looked as if the statue had just been placed there that morning. But the car had been abandoned for months. The dust didn't lie. The decay didn't lie. Even though the door hadn't been locked, the layer of dust showed no sign that anyone had entered recently. No handprints. No disturbed surfaces. Nothing. So how could the statue look like that? Clean. Perfect. Untouched. Michael slowly reached out and picked it up. Have you ever seen something that simply doesn't make sense? Something you stare at again and again, trying to find a logical explanation, but none appears? Michael stood there beside the open car door, holding the statue, looking at the peaceful face of the Virgin Mary. Finally, he placed the statue on the passenger seat of his patrol car. He returned to the abandoned vehicle, finished the report, and called the tow truck. 30 minutes later, the tow truck arrived. The workers did their job quickly. Michael signed the paperwork, and the old forgotten sedan was taken away. Michael climbed back into his patrol car. The statue remained on the passenger seat beside him. There were still calls to answer, more work to do, more routine tasks waiting. But when his shift finally ended that evening, Michael returned to the station. He gathered his things. Then he picked up the statue again. For a moment, he simply stood there looking at it. There was something about that image. Something he couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was peace. Almost as if the statue had been waiting there. As if it had been left in that abandoned car for him to find. But procedure was procedure. Michael sighed softly. He registered the statue as a found item, filled out the necessary paperwork, then walked into the evidence storage room and placed it on a shelf among dozens of other forgotten objects. And he left. But that night, Michael couldn't stop thinking about it. Dust covered everything. The dashboard, the steering wheel, the seats. Even the floor was buried under a gray layer that had clearly been there for months. Michael leaned closer and looked again at the statue. Not a single grain of dust. The colors were vivid. The blue mantle looked almost luminous in the dim light. Her face was perfectly clean, untouched. It looked as if someone had taken it straight out of a store box that very morning and gently placed it there. But the car had been abandoned for months. The dust didn't lie. The decay didn't lie. Even though the doors were unlocked, the interior clearly showed that no one had entered in a very long time. The layer of dust was uniform. No fingerprints. No marks. No disturbed surfaces. Nothing. So how could the statue be like that? Clean. Perfect. Untouched. How? Michael slowly reached out and picked it up. Have you ever encountered something that simply refuses to make sense? Something you stare at again and again, searching for logic. But there isn't any? Michael stood beside the open car door holding the statue of the Virgin Mary. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then he placed it carefully on the passenger seat of his patrol car. He returned to the abandoned vehicle, finished his report, grabbed the radio, and called for a tow truck. 30 minutes later, the truck arrived. The workers loaded the forgotten sedan onto the flatbed. Michael signed the paperwork. And just like that, the abandoned car disappeared from the street. Michael climbed back into his patrol car. The statue was still there beside him on the passenger seat. The day continued. More calls. More routine work. Nothing unusual. But the statue remained quietly beside him the entire time. When his shift finally ended that evening, Michael returned to the station. He parked the car, gathered his things, and picked up the statue again. For a moment, he simply stood there looking at it. The calm expression, the folded hands, the peaceful face. There was something about it. Something he couldn't explain. It didn't feel strange. It didn't feel frightening. It felt peaceful, almost as if the statue had been waiting there. Waiting for someone to find it. Waiting for him. But rules were rules. Michael sighed softly. He registered the statue as a found item, filled out the paperwork, and carried it into the evidence storage room. He placed it on a shelf among dozens of forgotten objects. Wallets, phones, keys, things that once belonged to someone but were never reclaimed. Then he turned off the light and left. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. Days passed. A week. Then 2. Then 3. Yet the image of that statue remained in his mind. The perfectly clean surface inside the dusty car. The strange calm he had felt while holding it. The peaceful expression on the Virgin Mary's face. It stayed with him. A month later, the case was officially closed. No one had claimed the statue. No owner had appeared. Michael returned to the storage room, filled out the release form, signed the clearance, and took the statue back. He placed it once again on the passenger seat of his patrol car. Then he drove home. Michael lived with his mother. Not because he couldn't afford his own place. Not because he lacked independence. He lived with her because she needed him. When he entered the house, Sarah was sitting in her usual chair beside the window. It was her favorite place, the place where she spent most of her days now. Soft afternoon light filtered through the curtains and gently touched her face. Sarah was 62 years old. Her gray hair was tied in a simple bun. "How was your day?" she asked softly without turning her head. "Quiet," Michael answered. He stepped closer. "I brought you something." Slowly, Sarah turned her head toward him. Her eyes searched for him in the space, trying to focus, trying to see, but failing. That moment always broke Michael's heart. Watching his mother try to see, and not being able to. He knelt down in front of her chair and gently placed the statue in her hands. Sarah lowered her head slightly. Her fingers moved carefully over the surface, feeling it. The cold plaster, the folds of the mantle, the delicate face, the hands folded in prayer. She didn't need to see. She already knew. "It's the Virgin Mary," she whispered. "Yes, Mom." Sarah held the statue close to her chest and closed her eyes. A tear slowly rolled down her cheek. A quiet tear she didn't even try to hide. Michael remained there on his knees, unsure what to say, unsure what to do. After a moment, Sarah opened her eyes again and looked toward where she believed Michael was sitting. "Thank you, son," she said softly. "Thank you so much." Her voice trembled. Michael placed his hand gently on her shoulder and squeezed it. "Do you want me to put it somewhere?" "Here," Sarah said, pointing toward the small table beside her chair. "Right here next to me." Michael carefully placed the statue on the table within reach of her hand. Sarah turned her head toward it. Slowly she reached out and touched the Virgin Mary's face again with her fingertips. Michael went to the kitchen to warm up dinner. But before leaving the room, he glanced back. His mother still had her hand resting on the statue, her head bowed, her lips moving silently, praying. And suddenly Michael felt it again. That same strange feeling he had experienced earlier in the patrol car. The feeling that the statue had appeared in that abandoned vehicle for a reason, as if it had been waiting to come home to his mother. Michael didn't sleep well that night. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the statue, thinking about the dusty car, thinking about his mother's face when she touched the Virgin Mary. It had been 6 months since Sarah began losing her sight. She had always been an active woman, always busy, always moving. At first it was small things. Difficulty reading small letters. Then trouble watching television. Then difficulty doing simple tasks around the house. Eventually she stopped going out. She stopped visiting friends. She even stopped going to church. "I don't want people to feel sorry for me," she had said. And now, most days, she sat quietly in that chair by the window, waiting for time to pass. Because the doctors had already said it clearly. There was no cure. There was no treatment. The doctors had been very clear. Sarah's vision would continue to fade until one day she wouldn't be able to see anything at all. It wasn't a question of if, only when. And Michael didn't know what to do. There were many things he could handle. He could work. He could pay the bills. He could cook, clean, and take care of the house. But he couldn't give his mother the one thing she truly needed: her sight. Another week passed. Life continued in the same quiet routine. Michael went to work. He came home. They had dinner together. They talked a little. Then the day ended, and the next one began. But something slowly started to change. Something small, almost impossible to notice at first. Sarah began talking more. Not much, just a little. She asked about Michael's day. She mentioned something she had heard on the radio. Sometimes she even commented on the weather outside. It was subtle, but it was different. 3 weeks passed. One Thursday afternoon, Michael returned home from work. He opened the door and immediately froze. The smell of food filled the house. He stood there quietly in the entrance. It had been months since he had smelled something cooking when he came home. "Mom, I'm in the kitchen," Sarah answered. Michael's heart began to race. He dropped his bag and walked quickly toward the kitchen. And then he saw her. Sarah was standing by the stove, cutting vegetables, stirring a pot. Simple movements. The kind people do automatically when they know their kitchen by heart. But Sarah hadn't been able to do that for months. Michael stood silently in the doorway. Sarah noticed him. She turned toward him, and she looked at him. Not like before. Not with that lost expression searching through the darkness. This time, she looked straight at him, and she saw him. Her eyes filled with tears. The spoon slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. Sarah raised both hands to her mouth, trembling. "Son," she whispered. Her voice broke. "Son, I can see you." Michael couldn't hold himself together anymore. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and wrapped his arms around her. Sarah was crying. "I can see you," she repeated through her tears. "I can see you, son." She said it again and again as if she couldn't believe it, as if she were afraid it might suddenly disappear. "I can see your face. I can see your eyes." Now Michael was crying too, holding her tightly. How many nights had he imagined this moment? How many times had he prayed for something to change? For something, anything, to help his mother? And now, it was happening. The next day, Michael scheduled an appointment with the ophthalmologist, the same doctor who had given the diagnosis months earlier. They needed answers. The doctor studied the old medical records first. Then he frowned. He repeated the tests. He asked Sarah to read letters, identify colors, follow points of light. She did everything perfectly. Every test, every line, every color. The doctor remained silent for a long moment. Then he finally spoke. "Mrs. Sarah?" His voice sounded strange. "You can see." Sarah nodded. "I know." The doctor shook his head slowly. "No, you don't understand. This doesn't happen. This condition does not reverse. It doesn't improve." He looked again at the results. Then at Sarah. Then at Michael. "I have no explanation for this." On the drive home, Sarah stayed quiet for a long time. Then suddenly she asked softly, "Son, do you believe in miracles?" Michael kept his eyes on the road, but his mind traveled back. To the abandoned car, to the dusty interior, to the statue of the Virgin Mary, perfectly clean where everything else was covered in dust. He thought about his mother, who had been losing her sight day after day, and who now could see clearly again. "I don't know, Mom," he said slowly, "but I saw you when you couldn't see." He stopped at a red light and turned to look at her. "And now I see you looking at me." He smiled softly. "Maybe I do believe." The statue of the Virgin Mary remained on the small table in the living room, right beside Sarah's chair. Life slowly returned to normal. Sarah began going to church again every Sunday. But something about her had changed. She started crocheting again, reading the newspaper, cooking meals, doing small chores around the house. But she also began doing something new. She started visiting people from church, people who were alone, people who needed comfort, people who had lost hope. "I know how it feels," she would tell them. "I know what it's like to feel helpless. And I know that sometimes miracles happen." Was it truly a miracle of the Virgin Mary? Doctors would say no. They would say there must be some medical explanation that science hasn't discovered yet. But Sarah knows what happened. And Michael knows too. Because some things cannot be explained. Some things cannot be measured. Some things cannot be understood. They can only be received with gratitude. Do you believe that miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen today? Have you ever experienced something that changed your life in a way you couldn't explain? Tell your story in the comments. Because sometimes the story you share may be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue to bless and protect you and your family. Amen. Folded hands.